All right, hello everyone. Hi. Thanks for coming to the MIT Museum tonight. I'm Jennifer Novotny. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here. And so this program was inspired by our newest exhibit called The Enemy. The Enemy is a virtual reality experience that puts you kind of face-to-face with enemies from 3 international conflicts. And the idea behind this is to look at these combatants' humanity, look at their dreams, and sort of try to understand a little bit about how similar perhaps people are on different sides of conflicts. And so while we ourselves are fortunate enough to not have war at our front door, we do still experience some of the same tribalism and creating others out of people in our world. And so I wanted to use tonight as an opportunity to explore kind of one form of otherness that perhaps is a little topical, the form of political otherness and how we can perhaps assume things about somebody based on their political beliefs, or perhaps say things that aren't the kindest about people of different political beliefs without actually knowing much about those people. And so tonight I invited 2 graduate researchers from the Lab for Social Machines. We have Nabeel Gillani and Anne Yuan. And so let's invite them up and hear what they have to say.
Hi, so I'm Anne. I'm going to start us off and then Nabeel will join in a bit. So as was mentioned, we're from the Lab for Social Machines, which is a lab within the Media Lab at MIT. And recently our lab's been focused on trying to understand the nature of political polarization. And the way we've been doing this is through, primarily through ingesting social media data and using NLP to kind of extract patterns from that data. But to start us off, here's a definition of polarization, just to kind of frame the discussion. And I'll just read this out loud to you guys. By polarization, I mean an intense commitment to a candidate, a culture, or an ideology that sets people in one group definitively apart from people in another rival group. Such a condition is revealed when a candidate for public office is regarded by a competitor and his supporters not simply as wrong, but as corrupt or wicked. When one way of thinking about the world is assumed to be morally superior to any other way. When one set of political beliefs is considered to be entirely correct and a rival set wholly wrong. And so we picked this quote because it seemed to kind of capture some of the spirit of the current political climate. So this is a graphic that shows the evolution of polarization in the electorate from '94 until now. And so as you can see, things started off well or relatively cohesively in '94, and it's kind of become more polarized as we get closer to now. And if this graphic extended to 2017, it's likely that we would see even more extremism. And so this is the kind of work that we've been doing, essentially trying to map and measure polarization using NLP and other metrics that we can get our hands on. One thing I wanted to mention about this graphic, so this is the x-axis here is consistency in terms of how liberal your votes are versus how conservative. So like if you voted liberally on all the issues that you were polled about, then you would show up as very consistently liberal. And if you voted conservatively on all of those issues, you would show up as very consistently conservative. So it's not a measure of how extreme you are, how extremely liberal your views are. You could be actually only slightly liberal, but if you were consistently liberal, then you would show up on the very left. That doesn't end up making such a difference in terms of the message that this conveys, that we're becoming increasingly polarized. But I think it's interesting to mention just to make the point that there are many ways to measure polarization, and actually you need to be careful because depending on how you measure it, you might paint a picture that is not actually true. And one piece of criticism that we just came across in our lab that I thought was really interesting is there's a method that's used to characterize political polarization within Congress called the DW nominate method, and people have noticed that the DW nominate method, it paints a portrait of stark polarization. However, it uses only two axes to measure people's ideology. And there's actually no stable ideological space on which to measure distance between candidates in a more objective way. And perhaps if there were, we wouldn't see as much polarization as we're shown. So that's background. And now what can technology do? So in our lab, in addition to mapping polarization and trying to understand it, we've also designed a series of what we're calling interventions, which are basically tools, software to help people try to bridge these gaps. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Nabeel.
Hi. So I'm getting over a cold, so I still kind of sound like Christian Bale from The Dark Knight, so I apologize in advance. But so I guess before we get into interventions, we haven't told you much about our lab, and we won't spend too much time on it. But in social machines, our kind of work is, I guess, divided into these sort of two pretty broad areas. So Anne mentioned NLP, natural language processing. We use natural language processing, data science, but also design in order to do work in children's learning, which if you're ever interested at any point, we can chat about that. But we'll be talking more about how we've been using some of those tools kind of on what we call the democracy side of the lab. So how are we understanding kind of new media ecosystems? How are we understanding the implications of those new media ecosystems on democracy and how sort of people participate in democracy? So this is one of the projects that our lab ran right up until the election. It was called the Electome. And the idea was, you know, the question I guess was, what is the kind of the modern version of the public sphere? What kind of conversations about politics happen? And the answer the lab settled on was Twitter, which is probably not the most representative public sphere, but it's at least kind of one place where people do talk about politics. There's one person in particular that talks about politics a lot on Twitter, who we probably know and probably wish didn't talk as much about politics on Twitter. But regardless, there was this sort of interesting question of, well, what are people talking about with respect to the election, right? Like, how are people talking about different issue areas? How are they talking about different candidates? And so our group worked on a kind of this natural language processing pipeline where they would ingest kind of 500 million tweets being made every day on Twitter, and they would run them through a few different machine learning classifiers. So one was just this sort of binary classifier that would tag a tweet as being about the election or not, and then another set of classifiers would then tag those tweets into different issue areas. So is this tweet about guns? Is it about immigration? Is it about foreign policy? Some interesting things we found in sort of doing that was there's actually kind of a disconnect between what people are talking about on Twitter versus sort of what the media is talking about and what people say in polls. So I think one of the interesting findings was that when people were polled, they said that they really cared about jobs. That was kind of their number one issue, right? Like, it's about the economy, stupid, right? So that's something people say was really interesting. But then when you look at the conversation on Twitter, most of the discussion was about foreign policy or terrorism. It was about racial issues. It was about the economy is also up there, but it wasn't the most popular issue. So you start to kind of see this disconnect between what certain people are talking about on social media and then sort of what mass media and what polls are talking about. So this is just kind of a picture of the dashboard that Anne and several others worked on in order to kind of show the relative kind of sizes of different conversations. And we were fortunate through the work to be able to work with several media partners. So we had media partners who used the dashboard in order to kind of write stories about what they were seeing. So they really kind of got a pulse on, you know, what do people on Twitter care about, and how can we kind of communicate that to the public. And then we were also fortunate to get to work with the Commission on Presidential Debates to basically take a lot of the analytics in terms of what people are talking about and use that to help inform some of the questions during the presidential debate. So we created these sort of briefing books that we would give to the moderators and just give them a sense of what does Twitter care about with respect to the election, what are the issues we should cover. So that was a lot of the work leading up to the election. And you know, there's this kind of question of what are people talking about, and that was kind of what a lot of that discussion, that project kind of covered. But there's also this question, especially when we think about polarization, of who's doing the talking and how are those people connected or not connected. And so this is kind of a picture of, we took a sample of people who tweeted about the election between, just about a year ago actually, between June and mid-September of 2016. We built sort of what's called a mutual follower network around them. So I'll explain what's going on here. So basically, these dots are people on Twitter, so they're accounts on Twitter. And the connections between, like a line between any two dots means that those people follow each other on Twitter. And the colors in this case represent the issues that these people talked about. So in many cases, they were multi-issue users, meaning they talked about several issues. In some cases, they talked about just sort of one of these issues over that time horizon. And so you can see, that there's kind of a piece here where people are really talking about racial issues over here. You got, looks like Social Security over here, some racial issues over here. I think terrorism may be somewhere around here. So there's no clear coherence in terms of, one question is, do certain parts of the social graph just talk about certain things? And the answer is like, kind of, but not really. So what happens when we recolor this network now, where the colors are not the issues they're talking about, but which candidate they're following on Twitter? So when we do that, we can start to see a pattern that you might sort of expect to see. So red in this case means that the account follows Donald Trump, but doesn't follow Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders. Blue means follows Clinton, but not Sanders or Trump, and green means follows Sanders and not Trump or Clinton, and purple means that they follow both Trump and Clinton. And what we found was that people who exclusively follow a candidate tend to support that candidate, as you could sort of imagine. So a couple of things probably jump out here. One is just this kind of giant cohesive right? I mean, the sort of right-leaning users, the Trump supporters, are pretty much living kind of in their own little bubble. You also have fragmentation. I mean, so the left-leaning users are not exactly sort of directly connected to them either, but they also don't form as cohesive of a unit. So they're much more diffuse. They're much more fragmented. What you can also see is that, and sorry, I should mention that this was measured actually 2 months after the Democratic primary. And so these allegiances, what this is basically saying is that there was a pretty somewhat substantial, or at least compared to Clinton, pretty substantial number of Bernie supporters 2 months after the nomination, 2 months after Hillary won the nomination. And that should at least give us some sense. I mean, we kind of sense this now, and we probably sense it during election time as well. But it gives us a sense of, this wasn't a left-right election. This was a very tribal election, right? Like, people picked a camp, right? Whether it was Trump, Clinton, or Sanders. And the left was still divided, even kind of in the months leading up to the election. Whereas on the right, we don't even show Cruz supporters here because they're an order of magnitude smaller than Trump. I think it was like 10%. The Cruz tribe was 10% of the size of the Trump tribe. The last thing here is the way, I should mention, the way these nodes are positioned, the way this layout algorithm works is that it ends up effectively, if two dots or two accounts have a lot of shared connections on Twitter, the algorithm ends up sort of positioning them really close to each other. Whereas if they don't have a lot of shared accounts, they get sort of pushed apart, shared connections. And that's kind of why you see this sort of bubble forming. But you also start to see this is not a left-right political axis. Again, there's a bunch of Sanders supporters that are plugged into Clinton supporters, but they're also plugged into Trump supporters. And what that suggests is the fact that there's some curvature in the space, it starts to suggest, hey, there's not just one dimension that we kind of measure politics on. There really is this, what we are now starting to see is sort of this establishment versus anti-establishment axis that we can sort of measure political ideology or political commitment on. We're starting to see that in the social graph. The last kind of punchline in this was when we asked the question of where does mainstream media live in this network? Where do journalists live? And you kind of light them up. You can see that they really are primarily in kind of this part of the graph. And this is actually right-leaning media, so Fox reporters, even some Breitbart reporters over here. I think the furthest we get, I think like Alex Jones from InfoWars is somewhere over here. So you still have this giant kind of, potential part of the electorate over here that's just completely disconnected from mainstream media. And so you ask the question, of course, this doesn't answer this question, but you ask the question, why were we so surprised, or were we so surprised by the election outcomes? We think part of the reason, as we've kind of seen and probably read a bunch about, is this kind of the existence of a media bubble. And if you think about Twitter and kind of the role Twitter plays for journalists, it's not really that surprising that we were able to kind of see this media bubble in the Twitter ecosystem. And then, of course, we have to make the graph rotate sideways, so that looks cool. And okay, cool. So that's kind of I guess this is sort of an example of mapping, and it talked about mapping. So this is us kind of mapping the tribal landscape. It kind of leads to this natural question of, is there anything that we can actually do about it? And what is the role of technology? If we see these things going on, is there a role technology can play, not to solve it, but at least to sort of poke at it a little bit? So one of the things, kind of a natural question going from that network, is to also look at, well, what's the content that people in these tribes are sharing? And is there kind of a disconnect? Are people who are living in one tribe or one part of the polarized social graph, do they tend to share certain articles or certain outlets or certain content that's different from people living in another tribe or another part of the graph? And the answer is yes. And this is actually a partnership. We work with Politico, and we've done some deeper analysis here, but this was an example of an article that we collaborated with Politico on to basically show, with respect to the Charlottesville events, how were people in the Trump tribe, what articles were they sharing compared to people in sort of the Clinton tribe? Right? And just from some of the headlines, you can start to get a sense that there really is we hear about kind of disjoint media realities or non-overlapping media realities, but you really can start to see like just the conversations or the things that people are sharing on either side are pretty different. So one thought is, well, this isn't solving the problem, but with at least access to data and the ability to map, we can at least start to show sides, right? We can show the different sides. Wall Street Journal has something called Red Feed, Blue Feed, which a lot of you may have seen, which tries to do something similar, which is for any given issue, can we start to see how are people on the right talking about it versus people on the left? And does that sort of give us any insight into what people value? So that's sort of one thing. Interestingly, we can actually see how often these things were shared. So I think these were the most popular Charlottesville-related articles that were shared by the left and right tribes. Another intervention kind of similar to that is, let's actually, if you live in this one part of the social graph, can we make it really easy to teleport yourself to another part? Right? So when you log into Twitter or Facebook, you see certain articles, you see what your friends are sharing. Can we help you flip that? Can we help you sort of teleport your feed to then basically flip your feed to receive the news and other information that somebody from a different side of the political spectrum would see when they log into Twitter? So that was kind of the idea behind this Chrome extension that we built, which is called Flip Feed. So Flip Feed is just a Chrome extension, you install it, and then you just start to browse. So you say load a feed, and you can sort of see what people on the other side of the spectrum are talking about. In this case, I think this is still a left-leaning user, so we actually randomize which feed we give you. We either give you a left-leaning feed or right-leaning feed, just because we're running some experiments on the back end of this as well to really understand how do you engage with this. Just seeing some different content really change your views. You can see this is probably somebody from a different side of the political aisle for most people in this room. And just some of the content that they're sharing, some of the way that it's being covered. There's a General Robert E. Lee account that somebody ran across. And so one of the experiments we're running here was this question. You saw that prompt when people loaded Flip Feed for the first time. So for half the users, we showed this prompt that just explains the tool. And for another half, we actually showed a prompt that explains the tool. And then we had a very simple sentence afterwards, which is, if you see something you disagree with, think of a time you and a friend had a disagreement. And the idea was to try to frame this otherwise probably uncomfortable, pretty adversarial interaction in terms that people could at least start to relate to, like, hey, I vehemently disagree in many cases with people that are closest to me, and I don't hate them, right? So, and what we found is that several people will fill out a post kind of Flip Feed survey, and what we found was that people who saw that prompt were more likely to say that they understand why somebody would hold the views that they do, the person who owns that feed, who they got transported to, why that person would hold the views that they do, and that they would actually want to have a real world conversation with that person. And so again, it raises this question. I mean, it's hard to say. It's very unlikely that those effects last over time. A lot of times these effects, you'll kind of measure them and then they go away. But it does raise this question of, these platforms have been designed in a certain way. If we could, design them in a different way, or at least frame the interactions on those platforms in a certain way, maybe there's hope for sort of facilitating different kinds of interactions. Excuse me. So another tool, so Anne and I worked on this tool. Do you want to talk about it, actually?
Is there a video that goes with it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just play it.
Yeah. So this is a tool we built called Social Mirror. The idea is that you log into the tool, you enter your Twitter handle, the tool tells you who your immediate followers are, and then it builds out that same graph that Nabeel was showing you, where it has like journalists and a Trump tribe. It builds out that graph, but starting from the perspective of your node. And here, this is just a video tour of the interface. So when people logged in, they would be able to kind of interactively explore that graph. So the purpose of the tool is for you to try to find yourself in the network. So this tour is meant to give you, to orient you, like give you a sense of what to expect in each part of the network, so that you can make an informed guess about where your node might be. And so here you see the nodes illuminated by location. And now you're able to explore and see what content was tweeted in each part of the network. All of this hopefully to inform your guess as to which node actually represents you. So here, it's making this guess. And at this point, we show you how many hops you were away, how many hops your guess was away from your true position in the network. After that, we show you, it's done, that's done, okay. Yeah, so after that, we show you a diversity score, which is, we show you a measurement of how representative your connections on Twitter are of the political spectrum. And if you have a low diversity score, then we give you a few accounts to follow in order to raise your diversity score. And the idea is that, you know, if you guessed a position, hopefully we're thinking that you'll think that your node is like pretty moderately positioned, like somewhere in the middle of the network. And then we'll show you that your node is actually in an extreme portion of the network, and that'll induce you to want to connect to more people who are on the other side of the conversation. So we launched this tool, and actually one of the most interesting things about the experience was getting people's reactions from the tool. So the way we launched it is we direct messaged all the people on Twitter who we had mapped to create that network through a Twitter account, and then they were able to message us back. And here are some of the things they said. So let's see. Yeah. Are you trying to ignite a civil war? So I think it's interesting to look at these reactions, because I was like relatively naive thinking about what people would say when, like, so imagine you get a message in your Twitter DM inbox that's like, hey, try out this tool. We think it could help with polarization. I just like did not imagine that could cause anything like anger, but it did. Like, I'm very aware of opposing ideas and opinions, but my echo chamber is voluntary, not accidental. I choose not to follow people opposite of me because I feel there is very little in common between me and them, given what I consider to be their self-centered cruelty. And then, I'm not interested in living in MIT's version of a well-functioning democracy. Fair enough. I have 0% diversity. Lol. That's not surprising. I'm pretty opposed to diversity, and there's no such thing as a well-functioning democracy. There are also some nice comments like cool, but a lot of anger. So that just, I think it's interesting because it shows the challenge of trying to, so like, you know, mapping polarization is all well and good, but we really wanted to design tools that would you know, hopefully do something about the problem, and this I think shows you know, just what you're up against, how a lot of people are intentional in their kind of political in their filter bubble creation. So yeah, and then Nabeel, I'll let you talk about this very insightful response that we got.
This one was pretty interesting. Yeah, so it's a little bit longer, but you can just read it. So there are people who have supported Trump for all sorts of reasons. Some people, including myself, wanted Trump to win because we had no idea what he would do. There are other people who wanted Trump to win because they thought he would accelerate the collapse of America. I feel it is very important that you do not use this as an indicator for politics, because virtually everyone I speak with, including myself, dislikes Donald Trump's performance. Most of us, including myself, dislike Donald Trump, but voted for him anyways. a few people I speak with liked him when he was elected, and a great amount more who I regularly speak with never voted for or liked Trump. My own politics are hardly represented by the Democrat-Republican dichotomy that is relevant to US politics. I myself do not even feel that democracy is good, and this is a fundamental premise of your project. I don't at all feel like I'm in an echo chamber as your model described. There are no people on Twitter with whom I can agree with on most things, and really it has gotten lonely. So this is a voice, actually, if you remember the Trump bubble in the other network? This is a voice from that bubble. So honestly, until I think we saw this, I've written off people in that bubble, probably like a lot of people have written off a lot of Trump supporters. And then I read this, and it just like, from a random person on Twitter, it's just like this, like, this is a lot more complicated than we think, right? Like, as much as I think any of us thinks we know the answer or can kind of lambast the other side, like, there's, I think, a lot more at play for each individual, given sort of their voting choices and everything else that leads to some of those decisions that are easy to observe, but really hard to understand the context behind. So that's all we had prepared. I mean, we were just trying to think about, so we're also offering a course this semester at the Media Lab. It's called Depolarization by Design. And really the idea is bring in really interesting people who are working on this stuff and know much more about us. One of the things that we didn't mention, if it's not obvious already, we're not political scientists, we're not moral psychologists. We've started to learn there's a lot of forces at play behind what we're seeing: spatial sorting, fundamental human nature, confirmation bias, et cetera, loss of trust in the media. These are some of the sort of, factors that we've heard about, different realities on the ground. We've heard a lot about the rural-urban divide in our country, I think, since the election, and kind of the different economic realities in some of these spaces. So there's a lot of things that we've sort of invited people to come in and teach us about this. And one of the things that we do is we kind of ask students to submit questions before each speaker. So these are just kind of variants of some of the questions that students in the class have asked and that have come up during that seminar. I'll just mention them just to kind of just quickly tee things off, and then would love to hear any questions or comments or anything. But one is just really, frankly, like, given all of these different forces, like, is it naive to think technology can do anything? I mean, we should have mentioned some people, as you probably know, believe technology has exacerbated the problem. So this notion of a filter bubble, if we live in a world where our feeds are algorithmically curated and personalized for us, does that further embed us in this sort of echo chamber? I think you talked to Anne. Anne had an interesting kind of quote a few weeks ago where she was like, well, it's not technology's not the problem or the solution, it's just sort of part of it. So what role can technology, if any, play in all of this? Another one is just, from a digital realm, and we're talking about media fragmentation as sort of one cause, meaning people are just getting more and more news on social media, and we talk about algorithmically curated feeds. A lot of those are driven by business models, and these platforms have business models. So, is there a way, if the business model of a platform has, at least in some way, contributed to sort of the Twitter graphs that we see and all of that, is there a way to repurpose those models for depolarization? One that's interesting, Marshall Gantz, who is behind a lot of Obama's organizing work in his campaigns, has been spending some time with our group, and it's been really interesting to learn from him. He has an interesting kind of philosophy about activism, sort of galvanizing support, getting people to sort of come together and work towards kind of collective change. There's an interesting question, I think, is activism inherently polarizing? When we think about doing any sort of work for what we would think social justice or the common good, often it requires creating a narrative that might sort of pit one side against the other. So is there a way to galvanize and fight injustice without exacerbating divides and sort of vilifying the other? And then the last one, all very easy questions, of course. The last one is this idea of humility, right? As much as we don't agree with other people, as much as we fundamentally just believe in different things, is there a way for us to engage kind of humility and self-doubt in productive ways, so that we don't necessarily write off the other side, or maybe we even kind of ask the simple question, what if we're wrong? And is there a way for that to not be used to yield, but maybe to have a more productive dialogue? So I know you guys solved all of that in past 2 minutes, but yeah. So I think that's it. Do you have anything else to add? Okay, great. So we'll just sort of pose that, and then I guess if there are questions, we can take questions.
Do you guys have any questions or perhaps thoughts on those questions?
So have you looked at things other than Twitter?
Because I imagine it's a certain demographic of people that are using Twitter, and it is missing quite a bit of the U.S. population. So have you guys any research on that?
Yeah, we're starting to. I mean, I think a big focus in the lab, I guess a big question right now on the heels of, so, you know, we had the election work, we had the kind of the post-election analysis, and now there's this really this question of how do we listen better? Because the way we were listening was through Twitter. But there's fascinating political scientists and sociologists. Cathy Kramer is one of these people we started work with. She's written a book called The Politics of Resentment. And what she did was actually, she, over the course of 10 years, as she describes, invited herself into like ad hoc conversations happening between rural Wisconsins kind of across the state. And she would show up at a gas station at 7 a.m. and just kind of listen to what they called the downtown athletic club, which was just a bunch of men, you know, in their middle-aged men or retired men talking about politics and other stuff. So we started to talk to her just about how can we kind of take this rich, almost ethnographic work that you've done, and I don't want to say scale it to cheapen it, but at least find ways to use digital tools to do more of it so that we can capture conversations almost in situ versus relying on some of these platforms that obviously people kind of construct a certain face or whatever when they use them. Kind of in the more immediate term from that, we've looked a little bit at public Facebook, not too much. But Facebook's tougher, as you can imagine, because it's not entirely public. That's one of the good things about Twitter. What else? Reddit, we've started to ingest some Reddit. Reddit, you could probably argue, is even worse than Twitter in terms of kind of where it skews. So, yeah.
The kind of like, sorry, the famous kind of Gentzkow-Shapiro media polarization paper, one of its conclusions is that there is less polarization than is kind of, well, at least back when the paper was published, there's less than kind of what's floating around in the kind of like public consciousness that, you know, everybody reads the New York Times and the Washington Post, but like the reason we see some of this like polarization is that only people, like a very small amount of people on the right read, let's say, Breitbart. And so that's what we're seeing when we talk about polarization, not that nobody on the right is reading New York Times, just that like there are a couple of sites that a few people read, but that they are very polarized. So like, does your research kind of suggest that this has changed during the 2016 election, or is this still broadly true and we can still, there's, you know, this kind of idea of having, you know, neutral media arbiters of the truth is still, you know, possible in this climate?
It's a good question. I mean, I'll start, and then if you have anything to add. But I think, first of all, it's like not clear how to even measure polarization. So I think you alluded to like this kind of shared media reading or media reality as like one measure. We actually just had political scientists come in and educate us last week about all of the many other ways that have been used to measure polarization. I think some are like roll call in Senate, like voting in the Senate and the House, or how are people voting. Some are some of the measures that Anne showed with the sort of the first two like distributions of how ideologically consistent people are when they're answering questions. So from the limited reading that I've done, against some measures, it's decreased or it's not clear there's polarization, and other measures, it seems like there's polarization. So I think part of it is maybe kind of not necessarily picking a definition or a metric, but at least looking at that question sort of through these different lenses. What was the second part of your question was?
Well, like, so doesn't, like, if this hasn't changed,
right,
then this suggests that like maybe media is not sort of like traditional media is not sort of.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that has changed is just the fact that like not everyone is logging into the same 3 channels anymore, right? Like the fact that people are getting a lot more of their news through social media and through these sort of more personalized platforms. So like, I forgot that we had a slide in here which we took out, but it was like something like at some point like 3/4 of the country would tune into one of 3, like 3/4 of the TV sets in the country would tune into like 1 or 3 channels, and now that's just like sharply declined, and people are reading more niche stuff. Like we can show you some of the data on, again, this is through the Twitter lens, but if you look at, you know, the top, you know, 10 publications that were shared on Twitter during the election, you're going to get the New York Times, you're going to get Breitbart, you're going to get Fox News, et cetera. But if you start to widen that out to the top 50 and top 100, like you start to get a bunch of outlets you probably haven't even heard of. So I do think like, even though people are reading kind of the New York Times, they're also reading other things that are really making their name by having very tailored, very niche, very polarizing content that I just don't think there was even the infrastructure for, 150 years ago. Yeah.
Oh, I did just want to mention something that I thought was really fascinating that we learned last week in our class, thanks to these political scientists we brought in, was that the way they described it, the 70s, or whenever there were those 3 channels that everyone watched, were actually the exception, not the rule, when it comes to polarization. That before then, there were partisan newspapers that people read, and there was just much less access to information, period. And now, of course, we have all these niche newspapers online. But so I guess zooming out a little bit to think about the historical context of polarization from way before, when we had those 3 channels. I think it is true that there's possibly less polarization by some measures. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is there was that reading we did a reading last week for this class on affective polarization was the term they came up with it. So even though it may not be true that people are more ideologically spread, something that has been measured is that people are just really rude to each other, more rude to each other than they have been in the past, and bitter.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting set of readings. If you want to, we have a link to it, we can send it to you.
For your using Twitter for your research, to what extent have you come across or dealt with the prevalence of robotic entities on Twitter, and how are you aware that impacts your study?
That's a great question. Yeah, for a long time, we had no idea if any of the dots that we showed you were bots or not. So we actually recently, on the network with the big Trump fireball there, we ran those through a bot detector recently. So this is a bot detector. I can send you the details if you're interested, but I think it's out of the University of Indiana. They basically use like some kind of AI architecture in order to, and they like factor in the frequency of tweeting and just a bunch of other features of an account to determine if it's a bot or not. Interestingly, in that network, I think it's only like 8% that were bots. And I think the Twitter, like there's other studies that have said up to like 20% of accounts on Twitter are bots. So the network we showed you was kind of a sampled version. It was sampled from this larger network. But at least in that case, even when you remove the bots, it doesn't really change kind of the structure of the network much. We haven't done an exhaustive study of how it affects the nature of discourse, but in many cases, in some cases bots are central, but in many cases I think bots are often very fringe when you're thinking about kind of the network of people participating in a conversation and how they're connected. So I think it just depends on the context, but in our case we haven't seen a huge impact.
One question is on your initiative around like Flipfeed. You got somewhat like mixed responses. Have you guys thought about what you would do to improve or try to gain more traction with that? And the second question I had was, oh, thanks.
The second question I had, it was just in my mind. And have you thought about or doing this for other countries? And have you guessed on places like countries in Europe, what the situation would be? Would it be similar to what you found here?
Take it.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So we actually did launch a version of Flipfeed in Turkey in time for their referendum. Because we had a collaborator in Turkey who worked with us on translations and stuff. I'm not really sure. Did we really measure
Not really. I mean, I think it was like I think we had a few thousand people use Flipfeed and a few hundred that use it in Turkey. So part of it might have just even been kind of coverage and who knew about it. But we never really drilled into the data there. People in France reached out as well. Like ahead of their elections, they were interested in having something like Flipfeed. But we never launched a French version.
But your first question is also super interesting. I actually have not thought about that deliberately, but thinking about it right now, I would say like, so the way we reached out is we sent like a paragraph's worth in a direct message to people to try to get them to use the tool, where we kind of framed the project by talking about like democracy and the political climate. And I think if we did it again, I would say like just like not mention any of those framing concepts. Just be like, here's some data, you know, explore, draw whatever conclusions you want. Because I think like bringing democracy into it just kind of made people mad.
This is her way of telling me I don't know how to write recruitment messages. The other thing at Media Lab, another professor, Ethan Zuckerman, who runs the civic media group at the Media Lab and does really interesting work kind of related to this, he had an interesting idea. He was like, it would be nice if I could pick the kind of person whose feed I want to flip to. Like, we kind of were like, oh, we want to run this as an experiment, so we'll randomly serve you a feed. But you can imagine getting super targeted, right? Like, I want to flip to somebody in rural Nebraska, right? Or whatever information sort of Twitter can surrender to us, we could kind of use that to give people a more specific way of deciding whose feed they want to see. So that could be something. Do you have ideas?
Nothing about comment.
Okay,
I was
okay.
actually going to ask like a similar question. Did you guys get feedback from the media partners? Because they seem to be the key cog here. So all those media partners you work with and working with this, what was their response to that? Because I mean, if you're going to make changes, it seems like they would have to be a big player.
Well, the media partners weren't so involved in flip feed. They're more involved in the election kind of mapping project.
Right.
Yeah. You know, it's an interesting question. We've been lucky, like Politico, for example, has been really interested in working together. I think they're really interested in covering the media, so it's very meta, but I think they really do want to show like, here's what the media is like doing right, here's where it could get better. So some partners have been really willing and interested in just generally working with us, and others haven't, but yeah.
I kind of like the first idea where if you identify where you're on the spectrum, and even if you can make incremental changes to your feed, so that's something that for me, I find that on my feed, I want to incorporate more voices from other sides, right? I don't want to make a wholesale change, but like even if you can do it incrementally, and then like work your way, maybe that might be a little bit less scary for people. Or,
yeah, the challenge, I think, somebody raised this though. The challenge is like finding quality accounts. Like one of the things that we did for the Social Mirror, which was like the Explore the Network and Find Yourself in It intervention, was we just picked people from that network that would up, if you were to follow them, would up your diversity score, and we were like, follow this person. We had no idea if there's a quality count, and not surprisingly, not a lot of people followed those people. So I think finding quality accounts and like voices from the other side that are like thoughtful and interesting, right, and like have something different, I guess, or meaningful to say can be tough for either side.
Looked at a time dimension. We looked at a time dimension to actually, like, kind of back to my other point. Is there real evidence that this has changed in any way since, you know, I mean, like, you know, I would say if you just ask me point blank, it's gotten worse since 2012, but there's no real evidence anywhere that like that's actually true.
We haven't. It's a great question. As far as I know, we haven't. There's a paper, it was published in ICWSM, the International Conference on Web and Social Media, I think last year, called like Long-Term Polarization on Twitter. And they use some trickery basically to kind of look at how it's changed in the past 10 years, just on Twitter again, based on which kinds of accounts people choose to follow. And I think they showed that it's gotten like 10 to 20% worse. And I don't remember how exactly I did this, but I probably shouldn't say it if I don't remember, but I remember somehow doing some back of the envelope thing with the chart that Anne showed, like the changing kind of the uniform turning into a bimodal distribution of ideological consistency. And I think online was like just almost twice as bad. I think like that 10 to 20% was like almost twice as bad as sort of other measures of how it's been measured sort of in the offline world. So again, don't quote those numbers. I think that the paper itself is even kind of a, you know, one version of measuring this, but it seems like when you're looking, you know, if you define polarization as how homogenous are the politically homogenous are the accounts you're following, it seems to have gotten worse, at least on Twitter. No. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you like got into or have any like ideas about getting into things like content or like influence, basically. I would call this like, how can I save the world through my tweets? Just more, and I guess like I'm thinking more of like things I see with Facebook, I guess, wherein like I have friends like in rural areas and friends like say here in Cambridge, and I see like very different like things coming from either area.
Mhm.
And I think about just like what would actually be like effective to say to like change perspectives on either side, and I just wondered if you had anything to like say about that.
Yeah. Do you have anything?
You mean like what kind of content would appeal to people on either side? Like in terms of researching what kinds of, like how could you change the tweets themselves to be more appealing?
Possibly like that, but also in the vein of just wondering, like when, it seems like there's a pattern of, say, people are talking about cats, and then an event happens, and then in either like sphere of things, basically like the same like tweets might emerge, and then things settle down, and then just kind of a question of like, does any of that like affect anyone's opinion on things, or is it all just kind of like people venting to their own sphere of things?
I'm not sure we've looked too much at that, but maybe something close-ish to that is I know Deb's our principal investigator of our lab, Deb Roy. He was really interested in basically surfacing these dog whistles, so terms that are highly meaningful for one, I guess, like political tribe versus another, where like, you know, someone who's liberal might casually use a term to refer to a group of people that someone who's conservative might see as like highly offensive, and you know, people on the liberals might have no idea that they're having that effect. And something that media partners have expressed interest in terms of working with us is algorithmically identifying these terms, avoiding using them, and I guess just using language that's sort of more broadly appealing. So yeah, as far as content, that's all I can really think of.
Yeah, I mean, for the other reasons Anne mentioned earlier, like this high degree of like affect and polarization, it seems like just showing someone a different piece of content might be a little like I find it very hard to believe that would work. Also because of some ways that people kind of engage in moral reasoning, like they form their moral intuitions or their opinions first, and then they sort of let reason or evidence follow. There is an organization, this is not exactly in the political realm, it's called Stop Funding Hate. It's based in the UK, and they do interesting work around content to try and put pressure on, I guess, like news organizations, for example, to stop accepting money from companies that fund hate campaigns. And so it's not exactly like I want to change, I mean, it sort of is actually, I want to change your mind, but it's more like let's use content as like an awareness builder versus like content on this like individual level, like maybe you're thinking to change individual minds.
First of all, thank you so much. This was super interesting. And it seems like you created these tools with this goal of decreasing polarization, but how have you thought about the comments that you received in those reactions where some people are choosing this realm, and how do you make an effective tool when the goal isn't mutually agreed upon as beneficial?
Yeah. We blame MIT's ethics committee for letting us know. I mean, so one thing we were actually just talking about earlier is how, yeah, we certainly started with this like, oh, like we're going to solve this, not solve this problem. I think that's a little bit ridiculous, but you know, we can build tools that like create windows maybe into different worlds that don't exist. And one way, like I think we started to think about it is more, the work we're doing is, you know, if we think of polarization as a giant beast, right, with all of these different factors and facets and motivations and causes and all of that, what we're doing is just kind of poking the beast to see how it reacts. So one way to poke the beast is send 1,000 direct messages on Twitter and then see what people write back. Sure, yeah, I was just saying one way to poke the beast is to just sort of send 1,000 direct messages on Twitter and then see how people sort of write back and what are some of the responses they send. But certainly, I think as we're getting into the data, we're seeing like, hey, maybe, we're seeing some effects. Maybe they don't last as long. There's also kind of clear, strong reactions against it. I think personally what that sort of raised is a question of, so George Lakoff, if anybody's heard of him, yeah, he's a cognitive scientist at Berkeley, definitely belongs in one political tribe, as a lot of us do. So a lot of his writing, I think, kind of shows that, but he's also talked about this idea of reinforcing mental frames. So he spoke specifically, I think, in several of his books around kind of, the example is like war on terror, right? Like by continuing to say war on terror, certain political camps reinforce like, hey, war is bad, but hey, terror is bad too. So you're doing, you're fighting terror, so that's a good thing, right? So by using certain words and certain phrases, like you can actually reinforce certain phenomena and certain ideas. And one of the things I think as our lab is shifting more to listening, I think we're realizing, hey, this is not a thing that we can, by talking about polarization necessarily, or by going to people and saying, hey, you need to live in a good democracy, like start listening to people. That a lot of these are symptoms, so you can't treat the kind of root cause by necessarily treating the symptoms. So the real question is, listening, for example, if one of the deep causes is we've stopped listening to each other, or we're not even listening to parts of our country, that's kind of one example of a deeper cause that maybe we can actually start to go and do something about. So I think our thinking certainly has started to shift from tackling this thing head on to trying to understand what's at the root of it, and being humble in the fact that we're not going to solve the whole thing, but trying to pick the right causes or the right pillars that we can actually successfully go after.
Thanks. I think you've sort of answered my question, which is related to your question number one, which is how technology can help depolarize. And I think, well, I've told my friends to stop sharing tweets about Trump because I don't agree with anything he says, and getting outraged will not change anything. So all we're doing is reinforcing each other. I am interested in solving some big issues. So I'm wondering if you've thought of sort of looking at these tweets and doing what you said, rephrasing questions. So if you ask people, like, is the ACA a good thing? They'll either say it's Obamacare, it's terrible, or it's Obamacare, it's great. If you ask people, do we need healthcare that we can afford, and how can we get there, then maybe you can get people from all over. So I'm wondering if you've played with that idea, coming up with a tool that we all can use.
Yeah, just quickly, great question. I think we've just started to talk to people involved in local government in parts of rural America. Sorry? Yeah, but people like county officials, for example, are not, like, at least the few I've talked to, are not really thinking red or blue. They're thinking like, my roads are broken, right? Or, we have an opioid epidemic in our county, like, what can we do about it? So certainly I think reframing and focusing on problems and sort of shared paths to solving those problems has a lot of potential.
Thanks. I got here late, so I'm jumping in without as much information as I'd like about what you've been talking about. But I just came from a meeting at City Hall here in Cambridge of a subcommittee of the City Council, and it's about the way in which the new separated bike lanes have been implemented and then the reaction to that. And it was packed. They had people up in the balcony and people forced to be in an overflow room. And the way a lot of there's a standard way for some of the city councilors to describe this as polarized. The people who want more bike infrastructure, it can't happen fast enough, it's wonderful, keep at it, don't stop. And other people saying, what are you talking about? Bicyclists in Cambridge are crazy. There's no such thing as a rule for how they ride. Why don't you do something about that? And by the way, you didn't implement this infrastructure very well. What that's an introduction to is my understanding. Polarization is a symptom, it seems to me. It's a symptom, and you probably already, I guess, are thinking about that. It's a symptom of disparities in power. You talk about listening and hearing. People say they listen, but they don't hear you.
And so I think a lot of what it gets back to is disparities in power and the reasons why it can then take the shape of polarization is because people are demanding to be heard, and they're not heard, or they're told they're listened to, but they don't feel they are, and I would argue are not. There's been a documentary recently on television about the war in Vietnam. That war went on for years and years and years, despite growing opposition from the American people. So that, anti-war movement versus the government, whatever it is, that's polarization. But polarization is something that has to happen when governments are listening to the people. And in the context of not just, I don't know what spatial sorting is, but I hope that's not a euphemism for inequality. When we're living in a country where there's tremendous inequalities of wealth, income, and power, and access to power, and the policies don't reflect the vast majority, but reflect a tiny minority, as is shown by the research of Martin Givens, who spoke at an MIT thing not too long ago. He's a political scientist, I think, at Princeton. Then is polarization quite the right thing to be as worried about as maybe you're thinking we should be, and are the sources of that polarization really what need to be addressed? And that would help alleviate polarization.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I mean, so a couple of things. One, spatial sorting is not a euphemism. Well, maybe it's correlated with, unfortunately, actually, economic inequality, but what we meant by spatial sorting was this, which was basically you have more and more what's called landslide counties in the country. So more and more counties in the country are deciding a candidate by 20% or more of the popular vote. So anyway, so it's just people are kind of organizing themselves into more and more politically homogenous units in the country.
Gerrymander, I mean, there's a
right.
process that's going on there too.
Right, that's true. That's a good point. But your question is actually, I think, why we included this question, which is, is activism inherently polarized? If you're fighting like perceived injustice or injustice, and you have to kind of exercise a voice for that, right? Like you have to create a narrative of like, not even create, but I think you have to expose a narrative of this is what's happening and this is what could happen, and there's this sort of gap here that does turn people off, and that can breed conflict. So that's an open question for us. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a good question. In fact, I mentioned Marshall Gantz earlier, who's done a lot of the work with Obama's organizing model. He's coming to our seminar at the end of this month to talk specifically about this topic, because I think it is something that we're not clear about. But I think to your point, certainly, I think we need to understand the root causes, and I think that's sort of where certainly our group's work is trying to get a better understanding of that. Like as we were talking about earlier, we're not. It's not only that we're not going to solve this problem of polarization, maybe it can't even be fairly called a problem if we don't kind of contextualize it with what are the forces that are actually sort of generating it.
Well, it's like, if I may add, it's like police violence, right? Is police violence polarizing? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And then people react and respond, and Black Lives Matter and other expressions of resistance on demands for a cessation of that appalling violence. And those people get labeled, or the question that gets asked is that polarizing? So I'm just introducing, let's look at, in that case, let's look at police violence as polarizing. Mm-hmm. And what do we do about that? How do we get government and police to be less polarized? Mm-hmm.
And I would also go back, and this is kind of part of where question 4 came from too, is also how do we do that, but how do we also not create enemies along the way if we don't need to? I think it's possible a lot of times, this is my opinion, I think a lot of times egos get in the way. I think a lot of times like our passion for an issue, which is obviously an important issue, can keep us from listening, right? And can you talk about double crux? I think it's pretty relevant.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I'm actually just stuck on what you're saying. It's really interesting. I do think that obviously the best plan A would be to solve police violence. I guess in the absence of a feasible way to do that, we're trying to raise awareness, or I guess methods of combating polarization we're hoping indirectly, get into the causal chain somewhere and hopefully address some of the root causes. But I think it's a really important point to remember like the real enemy, even if I think it's more just that we're not really sure what to do about that, and this is sort of a symptom that we're. But yeah, but sorry. So double cruxing. Double cruxing is this. There's this organization called the Center for Applied Rationality, and they have they do workshops where they teach people how to argue, basically how to reason with each other, and they have this method called double cruxing, which is it's a method for having a disagreement. And the way it works is, let's say that I think school uniforms are a good idea, and you think school uniforms are a bad idea. Well, the way normally arguments go is I'm going to continue to assert A, and you're going to continue to assert not A, and we build up these like just independent edifices, and there's like no interaction, and then we both leave the conversation thinking the other person is ridiculous. So the way double cruxing works is you're supposed to identify the thing that if it were different, I would change my mind about school uniforms. So there's some proposition where like that's my opinion about why people should wear school uniforms depends on this proposition being true. And there's some proposition where where it has that property for me, and it has the opposite property for you. So you think not that proposition, and that's actually the basis for your opinion that people should not wear school uniforms. So if the method of double cruxing is basically finding that one crux that's shared, and then going from there. Because once you have that sort of common ground, the idea is that even if you don't end up agreeing, you'll end up understanding why they believe the way they do. So,
why don't we take one more question?
Thank you so much. On a more technical note, I'm curious, what kind of analytic tools do you use to map those models? And have you thought about making those codes maybe open source one day so that more people could join into this initiative?
So, Anna hates it when I say this, but she's our data visualization guru in the lab. So, and does a lot of, I guess Anne can talk about the visualization side. On the kind of natural language processing side, most of the work has been using deep neural networks, so convolutional neural networks, to do some of the topic modeling of the tweets. That's, I think, been sort of the main workhorse behind kind of categorizing conversation on Twitter. And then the network stuff has been pretty straightforward in terms of just dealing with it as, Python, NetworkX, a few different network libraries. And then at this point, there's a lot of different network libraries that compute a lot of like network metrics like centrality or whatever else that you'd want to sort of measure about network. I think we're very happy to share code. I don't know if we've open sourced it, but it's certainly available. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to us and we can share. Visualization. Did you want to talk about visualization?
Sorry, were you asking if we've made any visualization tools open source? Actually, someone else in our lab, so there's this organization that's part of our lab called Cortico, and one of the engineers we hired, he's built this tool for basically visualizing any network in the browser. You just, you give it a data set, you attach some properties to it, and then it can basically lay it out for you, so you can do some of this analysis that we've done very quickly. And I don't know what his plans are for sharing that, but yeah, if we ever make it available, we'll let you know.
Let's give Nabeel and Anne one big round of applause. And thank you guys for joining us tonight. Just giving you a heads up, we have coming up in a few weeks on Tuesday, October 24th, we have Big Data 101. We are opening an exhibit called Big Bang Data on October 19th, and this is kind of the intro, get you into, aware, and some of the applications of big data. Big Bang Data, yep. Big Bang data. And then on Thursday, November 30th, we're having a talk about the neuroscience of empathy. So if you're kind of curious about a continuation of this related to the Enemy exhibit, we are exploring that as well. So thank you all for joining me tonight. I hope you have a lovely Tuesday, and hopefully we'll see you back at the MIT Museum.